Thank you. As I mentioned, Geoffrey Harris, Deputy Head for the European Parliament Liaison Office with the U.S. Congress, began his role in July 2012. Prior to that, he had been the head of the Human Rights Unit within the European Parliament's Directorate General for External Policies. This unit provided the backup for the Human Rights Subcommittee, a parliamentary working body working within the EP Foreign Affairs Committee. A longtime European Parliament official, he was in charge of interparliamentary relations with countries in Europe, but outside the EU, coordinating relations with the parliaments of all countries involved in the enlargement process, as well as Russia and the EU's eastern neighbors from 1992 to 2004. He served as a diplomatic advisor to the President of the Parliament from 1989 to 92, and worked as for the center-left socialist group from 1976 to 1989. Today's topic is a timely one and an important one, Europe on the eve of the 2014 elections. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Geoffrey Harris.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thanks to the Kennedy School for inviting me. It's quite an inspiring region. It's a very special university here, and if the idea is that everybody leaves here with a sense of mission in their personal and professional lives, that's a really laudable objective. In my own maybe more modest way, I studied as a postgraduate European studies in a place called the College of Europe in Bruges, Belgium. And there the idea was to instill in us, this is nearly 40 years ago, of course, or over 40 years ago actually, a sense of mission in relation to our work as Europeans. And I can assure you this mission is sometimes appeared accomplished. And if we talk about Europe on the eve of the 2014 European elections, it seems also as if this mission is somewhat threatened at a time of uncertainty, economic difficulty, and concern about where Europe is going in a difficult time for the European institutions. I would, however, say at the outset that anybody who predicts the future is in political life is unwise, to put it politely. And we have a program which brings people to Brussels to see how the European institutions work, and you have similar programs here in the US, and people come around. Sometimes people come to my office and then they will say, oh, somebody told me this will happen, that will happen, he'll be the president, this country will join, and such and such. And all I can say is, having observed the European Union from the inside, being aware of the different institutions, the different political views, yes, the complexity of the structures, I've always thought that people who predict the future are a bit dumb. So I'm not going to make any predictions. As I say, it's pretty obvious if you're even looking the main economic indicators, the public opinion indicators, that there is uncertainty in the air in Europe, economically speaking, and there are challenges to the basic European idea, which are getting stronger and will have to be addressed. Maybe looking at the audience today, one of the factors which people overlook when we talk about Europeans or Americans, the Americans of today are a different group than they were 70 or 80 years ago. The Europeans of today are a different set of citizens than they were a generation ago. And of course, ideas change, not just with circumstances, but generations change, and the way that historical memory interacts with political life, therefore, changes quite profoundly. At the beginning of the European integration process, obviously, the immediate memory of the Second World War, the Holocaust, provided an impulse whereby any kind of European integration was considered a good thing. There were no serious challenges, certainly in the first 20 years of the whole process. But now we live 100 years after the beginning of the First World War, nearly over 60 years since the end of the Second World War. Clearly the way historical memory interacts with current politics is quite different in all the different European European countries. Old friend of mine is going to be talking next week about Bulgaria and the enlargement of the European Union, what has changed. 1989, to me, to be blunt, seems like yesterday, Gorbachev, Reagan, and the rest of it, but it was 25 years ago. So when I was 25 years old, I mean, what did I care that much about the political life in 1950? Of course, so these obvious facts of political life are sometimes overlooked. But I'm going to begin a little by going back how the European Parliament comes to be here. The very fact that we have the elections coming up. First elections were, of course, in June of 1979. At that time, there were 9 countries in the European Economic Community, known affectionately as the Common Market. There are now 28 countries. Britain had only joined 6 years earlier. 4 years earlier, we'd had a referendum about whether we should stay in. We were quite clever in Britain. Rather than having a referendum before, we had a referendum after. But there you go. It appeared that the political process of integration had established itself, and so the first European elections were held in June, as it was, in 1979. At that time, the European Parliament had, I wouldn't say no power. It didn't have much power. It had one power, which was to throw out the budget the annual budget, which it tried once. It had virtually no power over legislation, certainly no power over nominations of major office holders. So the idea of having the European elections, which we now take for granted, whether we're Eurosceptics or Euro-federalists, the fact that we have these elections and we have something called the European Parliament is something not to be taken for granted, because the very existence of such a supranational institution makes the European Union quite different from any other international organization. And of course, it was France and Germany in the 1970s that pushed the idea of European Parliament elections. Talking about predictions, I remember vividly the day that Britain voted 2-1 to stay in the common market, as we called it. Our greatest European leader, a man who has many books, I'm sure you have in the library with his memoirs, Roy Jenkins, was asked, well, the next step presumably is going to be the election of the European Parliament. This was in June of 1975. And he, great statesman and brilliant man that he was, said, oh, I think that's something for my grandchildren. 4 years later, the elections to the European Parliament for the first time took place. So beware of predictions, even from the wisest possible sources, me included. So 1979, the elections took place for the first time. The members of Parliament turned up in Brussels and Strasbourg for their first meetings. They realized that they didn't have much power in a very simple way. They used their power to reject the budget in December of 1979. And a few weeks later realized that that actually didn't make very much difference. So the whole idea of changing the treaties, of developing a European Union took shape. There's a famous restaurant in Strasbourg called the Crocodile, and another one of my heroes, a man called Altiero Spinelli, who spent many of his formative years in jail in Italy as an anti-fascist resistance activist. He pulled out of the Communist Party of Italy well before everybody else realized where Stalin was taking communism. He turned up in the European Parliament, a fairly senior figure in 1979, and his aim was to get the European Parliament to spearhead the development of what we now take for granted as a European Union. And I remember vividly, in 1984, the European Parliament adopted a draft treaty on European Union. Wouldn't say it was met with great indifference, but certainly most diplomats or experts I spoke to at the time. By then I was a little bit older than you are now, but I took for granted what these experts were telling me. Well, it's a nice idea, but forget it, Jeff, it's never going to happen. But circumstances changed, France in particular, Germany, then of course the collapse of communism in 1989. Circumstances changed profoundly. 10 years later, we had a European Union. So again, another great prediction, which I listened to with a certain amount of anguish in the early 1980s, turned out to be wrong as well. So the European Parliament took the lead. You might say the European Parliament was too idealistic. It pushed the boat out in an undiplomatic way, proposing the idea of radical steps towards a European Union, and it turned out that it was just that little bit ahead of its time. So since the early 1980s, there have been a whole series of treaties. I haven't got time to go through all of them, but whereas the Parliament at that time had very little power, now it is a co-legislator. The budget has to be adopted by full agreement with the European Parliament, and as I will explain a little bit later on, has a major say over who gets the top jobs in the European Union. So we move from the Single European Act, which even Mrs. Thatcher accepted was a necessary step to free trade within the European community area, but as that process picked up speed, the idea of the euro, and of course then the political response to unification of Germany, the collapse of the Soviet Union led to the Maastricht Treaty and the establishment of the Lisbon Treaty. And then later on, the establishment of the European Union, and then later on the Treaty of Amsterdam, and most recently the Treaty of Lisbon, which really codified a very strong position for the European Parliament in a much more integrated European Union. In many respects, much more integrated even than the European Parliament had imagined 30 years earlier in the text of the draft treaty which the Parliament proposed as a basis for European Union. So in that sense, it's been a successful process. The political risk of having an elected Parliament pushing towards a political union has been successful in many respects. However, in another area, and particularly looking towards the next European elections, there are question marks as to how successful the process has been, because in the 35 years since the first European elections, the level of participation has gone down. It hasn't gone down, well, it's more or less where you are in the US in terms of electoral participation in your main elections now. So we've gone from over 60% to over 40% in the most recent European elections. So how far having the European Parliament has strengthened the legitimacy of the decisions made at the European level, that's an open question, and to some extent will be the central question of the European elections in 2014, precisely because in the current political era, there are people asking basic questions, even founder members, France and Netherlands. There are political parties saying, well, do we even need this European Union anymore? Maybe it was a great idea, but should we stay in it? And of course, there is always the special case of Great Britain, Groundhog Day coming up maybe in 2017 with a second referendum, this time not a few years after we joined, but nearly 45 years after we joined, with possibly the basic question of whether Britain should stay in the European Union at all. We can talk about that in discussion if you like. But basically, all through this process, there have been different schools of thought. The European election was the product of those who said we've got to take a political approach, the objective of a strong European Union, not just in terms of Europe itself, but also projecting itself on the world stage. Others saying, no, it should be a step-by-step, low-key approach, not quite surreptitious, but never quite spelling out what is going to be the next step and what is the final destination. And for those of you who are really studying this deeply, I'm sure you know, one, the so-called functionalist method is very much associated with Jean Monnet, and then the political unions more associated with Helmut Kohl or François Mitterrand, with Jacques Delors, if you like, the father of the euro, who, but the last great functionist leader, maybe took the idea of functional integration beyond the frontier, whereby it was possible to assume a public acceptance and no challenge to the next functional step forward. We had a common market, so now we need a common currency. That idea was perfectly logical and a good idea, but even France itself, when it voted on the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, nearly voted it down. So the country which had actually been campaigning for the euro, partly because of its concern over German unification, for a whole lot of reasons, nearly voted down its own idea. So that has been a constant tension. But in reality now we have a political union, and in my opinion, therefore, it's logical that there should be challengers to the whole structure who bring their ideas into the political marketplace. And that, I say, will be one of the central issues, not just in Britain, where we have a United Kingdom Independence Party, apparently quite strong. In France, we have the National Front, which is more or less an extreme right party, possibly poised to win the European elections there, but also, as I say, in Netherlands, Italy, other countries where Europe was always considered a good idea. I mean, being in Britain, I was always used to people being skeptical about what I do in Brussels and Strasbourg. But if I was in Italy or Spain, oh, wonderful, the European Parliament, it was kind of uncritical, something which I always found a bit strange. I remember referring a bit to the enlargement process when I was dealing with the different countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and I gave a little talk to some students in Hungary, and I said, well, what I don't understand about your country is, like, nobody's against it. You know, in our country, yeah, we voted 2/3, 1/3, but we had a really lively debate. I happened to be a member of the British Labour Party, and we had impassioned, if you think of Britain, of rational, cool people. Forget it. The British Conservatives, if you look at Mrs. Thatcher's experience, the experience of the Labour Party, extremely passionate debates as whether or not we should be part of the European community at all. And yet, yeah, Hungary is just the one example. You know, everybody's in favour of Europe, no amount of challenges. And then somebody asked me, so Mr. Harris, what's the correct level of opposition to European integration which qualifies us for membership, i.e. what shows that we are an advanced country? So happens that, in fact, Hungary has emerged as itself a rather questionable form of democracy. So my instinct that it's better to be having a lively debate and a challenge, you know, rather than the sort of elite, this image, which one does come across living inside a bureaucracy when we know best, you know, the people should just vote for what we've decided. Well, that's not how politics works in a democracy. So I say that era is certainly over now, isn't it? So even in Germany, you've got 9 or 10% voting for a party which even considers pulling Germany out of the euro, even though they're doing obviously rather well out of it. So looking to the next European elections in a few, I think it's 90, it was yesterday, somebody put out a press release, it's 100 days, so I suppose today that means there are 99 days until the next European elections. The main issues in terms of the European elections, what will they be? Bearing in mind that, of course, it's a European election, and I'll talk a bit about how that is organized, but also it's 28 national elections. It's a public opinion poll on how Mr. Cameron or the German coalition is doing, or let alone Mr. Hollande, who's visiting at the present time in Washington. So what are the main issues? Obviously, the economy, as in all elections, is always there, and at a time of relatively high unemployment and relatively low economic growth. Hard questions about the management of the European economy and the Eurozone in particular will be center stage. The issue of immigration, you may have seen, although Switzerland is not a member of the European Union, the vote, even a narrow vote, 51 to 49, whatever, or much less than that, against free movement, one of the sort of basic ideas of European integration, that is certainly going to be an issue. In Great Britain, one of the champions of enlargement of the European Union, the government is proposing sort of to question some of the basic ideas of free movement within the European Union, let alone the whole issue of immigration from outside. And don't forget, the European Union is surrounded by rather unstable, even increasingly unstable neighbors to the south and to the east. So immigration is a very big issue. The future enlargement of the European Union, what about Turkey, what about Ukraine, will certainly be among the issues. And of course, transatlantic issues will play a part, because one of the big projects which the next European Parliament will have to deal with, using its powers or exercising its powers under the Lisbon Treaty, is precisely the proposed transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which is a kind of transatlantic common market, which is already causing a certain trade issues in the Congress. I've observed are fairly controversial, but also in the European Union there are a lot of big issues. But it's a great project and hopefully will be a success. But for better or worse, and I say that advisedly, the Snowden revelations rather cast a shadow over the start of the negotiations. It just so happened, whether it was all a plot, as Mike Rogers suggested, or whether it's just an unfortunate coincidence that it's 2 or 3 days before the TTIP negotiations were due to start, The Guardian and I think the Times started publishing all these secret materials from the National Security Agency. So, but that in itself has become a transatlantic, it's obviously a European issue, how far Europe should be tougher towards the United States on these issues, and whether the European Parliament can agree to a TTIP unless there are some genuine reforms or guarantees about surveillance of European citizens by the NSA. But that is also it is also an issue of transatlantic interest. Senator Paul, I think, has started a class action. Leahy Committee is having a hearing at the same day as the European Parliament in Strasbourg has been voting a major report on this whole issue of NSA surveillance. But that certainly is one of the issues which will come up in most of the member countries. What is meant to be different and what could be different in the upcoming elections is that for the first time, as you have in a national election, the choice of the top jobs is very closely linked to the outcome of elections. You might say, well, that's obvious, huh? It always be, but actually that has not been the case up until now. So for the first time, there'll be different candidates for the post of President of the Commission, and I'll explain what will happen then after the elections to see who actually gets that job. There's also an open position for the presidency of the European Council. That's where the heads of state and government meet. So that's Mr. Van Rompuy's job. There is Baroness Ashton's position as the Vice President, the High Representative, the first foreign minister that the European Union has had in effect. So these top jobs come up, and of course there's a lot of political negotiation goes on behind the scenes. But what is different is that following the implementation of the Lisbon Treaty, the European Council comes up with a name as to who should take over from President Barroso after a decade in office. But it's up to the European Parliament then to elect this person, and that word is used in the treaty. What kind of process this is going to lead to, whether it will be a complete transformation of the European Union, remains to be seen. Obviously, whoever gets the job has still got to work with everybody as wide a range of opinion as possible. But for the first time, the European People's Party, which is currently the strongest group, mainly centre-right parties, excluding the British Conservative, or they excluded themselves, that they will choose somebody. The Social Democrats have proposed the current President of the European Parliament, Mr. Schulz, to be the President of the European Commission. The Liberals have nominated a former Belgian Prime Minister, Guy Verhofstadt, who played a big part in the whole process leading to the European Constitution, or the draft European Constitution. So those three names will be put forward, and the idea is that they will shall we say, clarify the choice which is before the European electorate about what direction the European Union should go. So this is the first time this has happened. We'll see how it goes in terms of politics, because, of course, the national media tends to concentrate on the national issues. But for the first time, having a competition about who gets what job, that's the kind of relatively simple issue which the media is very likely to latch on to. So after the elections, it's the last week of May. If you wish to take time out from your, what day is it on the 20th? What day is it? Not the President? No, President's Day is next Monday. What day is it of the last weekend of May? Memorial Day, sorry. I shouldn't. Anyway, if you want to take time out from Memorial Day holiday to observe the results of the European elections and then to watch the procedure unfold. The different political groupings in the European Parliament, the members elected there, have to choose their leaderships in order to start negotiations about who gets what particular job. The European Council will have an informal meeting a few days after the elections. Then a few weeks later, the European Parliament will meet for the first time, elect its own president, and receive the nomination from the European Council for the President of the European Commission. And then there'll be a test as to whether that person gets the positive vote of a majority of the members of the Parliament. It's quite a challenging threshold to overcome. Also, it's equally challenging, of course, were the Parliament to fail or not be willing to accept the nomination of the European Council, we'd have quite a big constitutional crisis. Indeed, in the days after the European elections, for those who are hypersensitive in financial markets, the results could indicate a period of internal bickering and differences between the institutions and create some uncertainty on the economic front. But it is expected that sometime late in July the name of the President of the European Commission will be endorsed, i.e. elected by the European Parliament. This person then has to put together a commission of 28 members, including a Vice President who will be effectively in charge of foreign relations. And then in September, October, each one of these has to have a hearing. That's very similar to your system, except that in this case, unlike you have a hearing and then, sometimes you get round to having a vote and the guy gets the job a few months or later or whatever, in the case of ambassadors, sometimes longer. In this case, after each hearing, the committee that deals with environment issues obviously has a hearing with the commissioner proposed to deal with environment. If they're not really very happy with the person and the reasons, and there's a consensus in that direction, the President of the Commission really has to find somebody else, which can be quite delicate because the commissions are also one from each member state. Therefore, the British or Irish government who's nominated this person, an Italian had to step down, Bulgarian also in the previous round. So it's not without precedent for individual commissioners to be changed and for a little reshuffling of the mandates to take place. But it has to take place fairly quickly because in October, the European Parliament has to vote on the programme and the composition of the Commission as a whole. And then the whole structure is in place. So that's quite a long process between the end of May and the end of October. And say if there were to be economic and political uncertainty, that could be a signal to the financial markets. It could be a signal to our friend in Moscow who likes to sort of play around with the European Union in a fairly negative way to take advantage of the uncertainty, let alone others. So what we're looking at, we have an election, just like an election, who's the president, where's the majority, minority, but unlike in a national political system, particularly in yours, it's not a winner-take-all situation. Where now the committees of the European Parliament are shared out proportionately according to the size of the different political groupings, and whereas in your Senate and House, clearly that is not the case. And of course, whoever is president of the Commission knows that to get his legislation through, he's got to get a majority of the Parliament voting for, so that gives a push towards consensus, whoever gets the top job. It's not a majority system. As long as you've got a majority of one in Parliament, you can do the job. You can't do, the European Union cannot, at least at this moment in its history, work on that basis. And one of the things to look out for in the European elections will be how far these different Eurosceptical forces, which I've mentioned, can actually work together. If you study right-wing extremism, neo-fascism, traditionally, precisely because these guys are rather nationalistic, they've had a great difficulty in coming up with sort of a coherent ideas and therefore forming a political group within the European Parliament and maybe then say, okay, well, since you share out the positions, what positions are we going to get? That would be quite a challenge to the mainstream political parties. So that's one thing to watch, and that would happen quite quickly in the weeks after the elections. There's already quite an interesting meeting between the leader of the French National Front, Mrs. Le Pen, and the leader of a very strong Dutch political party, I think it's called the Freedom Party, whether they, with others, would be able to form a political grouping and get their share of leading positions. So basically we'll be in a very new situation, a lot of new faces, but with the basic economic problems that the European Union has faced since the financial crisis of a few years ago. Not making any predictions. I'm not personally expecting a political earthquake, but who knows? That's up to the people in the different electorates to decide. Whether the relatively decline of participation in the European elections will continue remains to be seen. It could be that the very activism of the Eurosceptical forces will actually boost participation, whereas people who don't really like the idea will actually at least exercise their vote and have their say. That remains to be seen. But I think one thing I would risk a prediction about, having said that since 1979 there has been a huge and unexpected, I would say, certainly referring back what I was saying, the early 1980s, deepening of the whole political integration process. I wouldn't expect major constitutional changes in that direction in the coming years. There may be changes, particularly the Eurozone countries might strengthen their own sort of political governance. One idea, I don't think anybody is going to run with this, but just, well, since we have a Eurozone, they should have their own parliament. We should have another European parliament. So it seems a bit unlikely. So some kind of multi-speed Europe is inevitable, precisely because whether or not Britain stays in or out, clearly we're not going to join the Euro in the foreseeable future. The other process which, looking back, was quite unexpected, and you'll have another discussion next week about the impact of the Cold War, so just to say it totally transformed the political environment, didn't it, and led to a much bigger enlargement of the European Union than anybody had ever expected. After all, when Britain joined, there were some doubts in France. They even had to have a referendum whether we should be allowed in. And maybe, and then we had our own referendum. Then since then, the enlargement process has gone further and faster than anybody could have expected, even in the early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The enlargement to now 28 countries has been a huge historical process, relatively successful, I would say, but there are big questions now in Ukraine, in Turkey. I don't think they will join the Union in the next term of the Parliament, but clearly there in very, very important strategic decisions will have to be made as to how the European Union responds to their own aspirations. Now, looking at this from the from the United States perspective, since we're here, in such a respectable establishment as the BYU, I'm not going to quote Victoria Nuland, but she's got quoted fairly widely, and basically what she's supposed to have said reflects a certain frustration, putting it politely, about the way the European Union responds to crisis situations. She and the administration, many people in the Congress, very much favor sanctions on those who've been causing the violence in Kiev and elsewhere. The European Union preferring a dialogue to try and stabilize the situation. So it's a genuine policy difference. So the question from the perspective of the United States is always, has Europe really come up to the plate? And the United States has always sponsored, if you like, encouraged the European integration process. Obviously, the US, shall we say, says, well, you should enlarge immediately, let in Bosnia, let in Turkey, but of course, it's a problem that the European Union would have to handle if it were to follow such advice. But the question is whether the European Union comes up to the plate. I would say that the establishment of an external action service, of EU delegations, of a foreign service, this was a huge step, and therefore the establishment was unlikely to be followed by a sort of radical change of the political reality, namely that somebody in Brussels can't just decide what everybody from Lisbon to Helsinki to Malta thinks about Ukraine. By definition, Baroness Ashton can establish a structure, but she cannot, like a Secretary of State, although even there one sees sometimes tensions between Secretary of State, President, that sort of thing. That is a work in progress. Hopefully the European Union after the elections will be in a strong position, and the next High Representative will be more confident to take a leading role vis-à-vis the states in order to outline the main positions on foreign relations. So that's one of the questions to watch out for. But certainly also those less well disposed to our interest globally, China, Russia, also follow with great interest the European elections. I can assure you from my own experience, observation in Brussels and in Washington, precisely because every agreement that the European Union makes with another country or group of countries, I mentioned the US already, has to be passed by the European Parliament. So China is not officially against better relations with the EU, but is well aware that if there is going to be any contractual relationship, any kind of treaty between China and the European Union, that would have to be ratified by the European Parliament. And I haven't got time to go into all the work I did on a previous job as the head of the human rights part of the Parliament Secretariat, but the Parliament also has a lot of soft power goes along with its hard powers, as in your Congress, hearings and resolutions. There are things like the Magnitsky Act, but there are also resolutions on human rights in Cuba or China. These have an impact, and it's always been striking how governments around the world don't like being criticized by the European Parliament, even if the decision of the Parliament doesn't have an immediate economic or legislative consequence. So that is my view of where Europe is on the eve of the European elections. I say I would underline the uncertainty. I wouldn't ignore the challenge to the basic idea, although on the other hand, looking back on the last 30, 40 years, it has been a record of quite remarkable achievement, particularly, I say, the whole enlargement process. And quite frankly, we live in democracies. My country, as much as any other, the people decide if I'm confident that they would decide to stay in were there to be a future referendum, but I say that is up to a collective decision. And I say, just finally, not to overlook the basic fact, which in my view is the simplest and most important one, that the Europeans of 2014 are a different few hundred million Europeans than the Europeans of 1944. So by definition, the way they react to different events is going to be different. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for your interest in the European Union. Through our contacts with the school, we're very happy to help you and your professors as much as I can to deepen your understanding of how the European Union functions. So thank you for your attention.
We have a little under 10 minutes, and we have a mic queued up if you'd like to line up behind and take the remaining time to ask questions. Please tell us your name and what you're studying, and then you can ask your question. Feel free to line up so we can make best use of the time that we have remaining.
Hi, I'm Savannah Eccles. I'm studying political science. You mentioned that you worked in human rights. So from your experience, do you think that the European Union as a whole is doing enough to welcome and settle refugees from Europe's very unstable neighbors?
No, is the answer to that. But as we are aware, as you also live in democratic countries, what we in the institutions might think is the appropriate response to demands for asylum and refugee status runs up against public opinion. And you've had so I think I would say personally we're not doing enough, but as I mentioned, immigration of all kinds, including illegal refugee administration, is one of the issues. And precisely because of the unrest around the European Union, there is a kind of fear in society about too many refugees. Some political parties overstate the nature of the threat, others. So I would think the short answer to your question is certainly not doing enough. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sam Dearden, studying history. What exactly do Eurosceptic parties aim to do once elected? I know there are very, very many different varieties of Eurosceptic parties. For example, the UKIP. Would it try to impede proceedings in Brussels? Would it use something similar to cloture in the United States, where we try to take the government hostage and things like that?
Well, obviously, it's pretty unlikely that the Eurosceptical forces will dominate the European Parliament. They may be stronger than before, and I would say any politician who gets elected, their main aim is to do well in the next election. So that could be in terms of the national election, let alone the next European elections in 5 years' time. But certainly in the run-up to the elections, the very question that you put is one that's going to be asked. So, okay, I mean, you're elected, so what are you going to do? I noticed today somebody was attacking the UKIP members of the European Parliament because they'd failed to show up for a vote on bankers' bonuses or something, because they're so busy being Eurosceptic, they're not actually doing their job as legislators, whether that's too sophisticated for the voters and they just want to kick the bureaucrats in Brussels, for better or worse, I don't know. And as you look at each party, you then get sort of different sort of nuances. Mrs. Le Pen, for better or worse, is accepted as part of the political debate in France, not sort of just shunted to one side. On the other hand, her idea of France leaving the euro or having a kind of national preference for sort of free movement of workers doesn't really seem to get much traction. But I mean, that wouldn't necessarily prevent somebody doing well in an election. I think really the question would be, will they be able to form a political grouping and I'd say join the club? Certainly not. I don't think that's very likely. They'll be well aware that if they just show they just sold out, and they may decide we don't want any of these leading positions because otherwise we can face that accusation. But certainly it is a challenge, and there, of course, each national party has a different situation. The Independence Party in Britain has gone from being a fringe party to one which could influence the outcome of the next general election in Britain. It's not going to win an election by any stretch of the imagination, partly because of our voting system, which gives more space in European elections than it does in national elections. So they want to do as well as they can in the next national election. Le Pen in France, her father got to a runoff in an election for president. That clearly is the aim of any French political leader, is to get into the last round and to get elected president of France. Seems pretty remote, but in the meantime, she would use her perch in Strasbourg and Brussels to try and score some points. So I think that is a question which varies very much country by country. Okay. So I don't think you're going to. You may, however, get a sort of detailed program from these parties collectively, but I doubt it.
All right, thank you.
I'm Connor Kreutz, studying international relations. If Britain were to leave the European Union, what would be the impact on the European Union and on the makeup of the European Parliament?
Yeah, well, there you're touching my heart as well as my brain. What is actually on the table at the present time? It's a sort of very much a Groundhog Day type of situation. In the early 1970s, it was the left, the Labour Party was split on Europe, so when he was the leader of the opposition, the Labour Party leader said, well, if we get into power, we'll renegotiate our terms of membership and then we'll have a referendum, which he then, for various reasons, he got in, and he did that in a year, 18 months, had a referendum, and it was all over, at least in that particular period of history, by a year after the Labour returned to power. In this case, it's a more long-term procedure, potentially making it harder or more difficult to manage, more unpredictable. David Cameron has said that he wants to renegotiate Britain's terms of membership, and he would then if he has a majority in Parliament, because Labour or the Liberals, the other large party, if you like, currently in coalition, they don't even agree with this. But the government the Conservative part of the government has put this idea forward. If they win the general election in 2015, they would renegotiate and then have a referendum in 2017. The big difference is that in the 70s, Britain was a new member. And there was a lot of sympathy for the fact, well, it's just something new. Labour had made this commitment in advance of an election. Let's have change some of the terms. They weren't that big changes, but there were some changes, and then a referendum took place in a reasonable period of time. In this case, it's a rather slow procedure, and so far, nobody of any importance in any of the member states, so far at least, have said, okay, well, we could do that, and then we could maybe do this, do that. So it could be that Mr. Cameron would then have to have a referendum without having succeeded on any renegotiation. Were Britain to leave the European Union, depends which way you look at it. Since you got rid of the British Empire some time ago, you might say, well, that's just a continuation of a process. By the way, we have a referendum in Scotland, which some of its leaders consider to be still part of a kind of British Empire. So you might say this is just a historical process, and Britain will become a sort of marginal European power, completing an historical process over a few hundred years. You could, however, also say that Britain does have, in spite of all this network of alliances, it's close to the United States, and it would be a devastating blow to the European Union were Britain to leave. I think what would be most devastating, it would open the idea that it's not that difficult to leave. So others might say, oh, can we leave? So this might come about. But what is striking to my ear, and I don't think I'm the only person who's noticed this, that since Cameron took this position, Obama made it clear, both in his own media and in London, that he didn't think this was a very good idea, or at least he wanted Britain in the end to stay in. And there's this very warm relationship with France developing, with underlining that this is our oldest ally. Not that that isn't an objective truth, but something maybe hasn't a point which has not been made quite so strongly. So personally, I would think that the idea of Britain leaving the European Union, to my personal opinion, that's a majority, certainly the view of my institution, and indeed most of the members of the British Parliament at the present time, this is all a bit of a waste of time, that we should be concentrating on economic issues and the whole issues of the European neighbourhood rather. But for Britain to leave, it depends which way you look at it.
Thank you.
Whenever I hear about the European Union, my name's Mark Hedingren. I'm studying entrepreneurship. And whenever I read about the European Union, always strikes me as a similar discussion that we have in the United States between states' rights and federal rights, and many of the same things that went on during the Revolution or the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, or the Civil War. Do you see that there's any parallels, or do you believe the European Union will go differently?
Well, I'll answer it like I answered the first question. I think the parallels can be overstated. I mean, certainly, of course, you have a separation of powers here. We have a strong legislature, and so whereas we have obviously developed parliamentary democracy, precisely that the king shouldn't be too powerful, that sort of thing. But I mean, I think to look at a nation of 300 million people descended almost entirely, from different immigrant groups, if you like, apart from the Afro-Americans, and the occupation, not to say the conquest of the territory of what is now the United States. There's a totally different historical background to a situation where we have 500 million Europeans, 28 different countries speaking different languages, different religions, and of course people who come from different areas. Croatians, most of them come from Croatia. They didn't move from Finland. They may have done a few million years ago. Or Norwegians come from Norway. British people, so of course there's immigration and migration within. I think you're dealing with a concept of statehood in London, which, if I may say so, is different than a concept of statehood in Salt Lake City. I mean, to put it in a simplistic way, but just to answer your question, I would say these arguments can be overstated. If you say the development of the powers of the European Parliament within the European Union, the power over key nominations, ambassadorships, all this kind of thing, you could say, well, that's a bit similar to the functioning of the US Congress. But overall, I would say the constitutional development of the European Union started in the 1940s after the Second World War. You had a war of independence, then midway through your development had a civil war, so I would say the parallels shouldn't be exaggerated.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Fliaka Ismaili. My question goes, well, kind of along with one of the previous questions. It says that only 19 out of the 28 countries have these far-right parties that could potentially gain support. Will that be significant support, and then would it be significant support to cause a stagnation in the parliament? And also you mentioned that one of the main issues would be the enlargement. How, like, the potential raise in these far-right parties could affect the enlargement? What could they do, like, to cause stagnation in the process, like the countries that are already in the process?
Yeah, well, basically, to some extent, I was answering this question before, namely that it would depend how strong collectively they are among the 750 members. At the moment, it is possibly 60 or 80 or 90 such members. Would they be able to form a political grouping? Would they be coherent in a way which would prevent the majority, maybe centre-left, centre-right liberals, but which would have over 400 or so, 500 members. So that remains to be seen. Of course, when I say it can affect enlargement, of course, the populist parties, if you like, they use arguments maybe don't have much substance, as if Turkish accession, if you like, is an immediate, inverted commas, threat, and therefore vote for us, we'll stop Turkey joining. Well, for the moment, certainly for the next 5 years, it's a question of continuing negotiation with Turkey. Ukraine, you might, now the hordes of people coming from Ukraine, they're all going to take our jobs. Again, Ukraine has to stabilize, maybe apply for membership of the European Union. So in that sense, it's a bit about the question about asylum and immigration. The concern, the fear of outside can lead to a kind of introversion, which would slow down the enlargement process. But I think the enlargement process will continue. The next main group of countries is obviously in the Balkans, but that is also quite a slow process anyway. But of course, in elections, you play up certain threats. The same as people run for election saying trade is a terrible thing and we can't have all, and then you are president and you're recommending a trade agreement with the European Union. So the electoral process can certainly play on some of these fears, and that is will be part of the election campaign.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you.